Hi, this is Gerry Baker. I'm editor at large with Wall Street Journal. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much indeed, all of you, for joining us. I'll get straight into this. This panel is entitled One Step Back, Two Steps Forward, which is an attempt to explore the issue, obviously, of sustainability in the context of the COVID-19 crisis. A cynic might say that we've managed to achieve in the space of 2 months in terms of the impact on the environment, what environmental activists have been urging that we should be doing within the next 5, 10 or 15 or 20 years, which is obviously so dramatically reduce economic activity that we've reduced the, presumably the carbon footprint of our activities by an extraordinary amount. We're seeing GDP numbers, obviously, in the US and around the world in this quarter of probably in excess of 30% declines. So, but obviously that's going to turn eventually, and the larger questions are: what are the long-term implications of this? What are we learning from this crisis in terms of a sustainability agenda? What lessons are we learning? What can we do? What needs to be in terms of the way in which the world is coping with this? What might that tell us about a more environmentally sustainable world beyond this? We have a very distinguished panel, and I want to just very quickly introduce them. Jenny Davis-Piku is the head of global sustainability and corporate responsibility at Bain. Thank you very much, Jenny, for joining us. Gert Sylvest, co-founder and GM of Frontier's Tradeshift, and Bertrand Barret. I think you're there. Yes, I can see. Sorry, Bertrand Badre, yes. Founder and CEO of Blue Like an Orange. You can explain, perhaps, Bertrand, when I come to you, where exactly that name comes from. But anyway, it's obviously a very lively topic, very important and very current topic. I want to start, if I may, Jenny, with you. And as I said, in my very brief introductory remarks, we are perhaps learning a little bit from, in an unexpected and very unwelcome way, what perhaps a more sustainable economic environment might look like. How do you view this? What can we learn from what's happening right now, Jenny, in terms of what we do need to do longer term? What are the implications of this crisis for the sustainability agenda?
Great. Yeah. Well, thanks very much. Thanks to Tradeshift for hosting the panel. Thanks for putting me on the spot in terms of having to go first. I guess, Gerry, one thing that I might disagree with in your opening introduction, I don't know if the activists would want to solve the climate crisis, for example, by cutting economic activity by 30+ or more %. I think actually the real question that lots of folks are working on is how can we actually preserve the economic activity that we've got, but in a way that actually is fundamentally more sustainable than the way that we're doing right now. And I think that's really the lens through which I think that we can look at the lessons that we might take from the current crisis. Actually, I would call this a dress rehearsal for some of the bigger disruptions that are to come, whether it is from climate change, which is the big one that's obvious, or some of the other sustainability issues that we're facing through our supply chains and our economies. I think the first lesson that I would draw is that actually it's not really about prediction. There's been a lot of discussion about, is sustainability going to get knocked off its perch? Is it actually going to get accelerated? Which way do we think the headwinds and tailwinds are going to come out? In some ways, it doesn't actually matter. It's not like people didn't have a pandemic on their predicted risks. They just didn't prepare for it. And so for me, it's less about prediction and more about resilience and adaptation, and making sure that actually we are prepared in our businesses to be truly resilient to even the most unexpected things that we've predicted, and also adaptable in ways that we're having an unlikely and unwelcome opportunity to pressure test. So for example, people used to think that my call center network was resilient because actually I had call centers in lots of different countries. Well, actually, when nobody can go into the call center, it doesn't matter how many countries they're in, you actually need to build your resilience in a different way. And so the first lesson I would take is that it's not about prediction, it's about resilience and adaptability. And there, I think, I don't want to monopolize the opening comments. I think there's plenty to learn there in terms of how supply chains, for example, are being impacted by the current action, whether that is indeed on the configuration of the supply chain, the length of supply chains that have been set up, but also I would say some important lessons about the human individuals and impacts that are involved in those supply chains in terms of actually what really it means to take care of our workers and really create a system which is not just sustainable but also equitable, so the economic activity that we're creating is not damaging either of those two. So we'll come on to talk about more specifics, I'm sure, but I can stop my opening comments there. Still on mute, Gerry.
Sorry, I actually muted myself to stop myself interrupting anybody. Gert, perhaps I could come to you. The general, it's as often happens whenever we have major international events, and obviously this is unprecedented in its scope and scale, but people, commentators generally and business leaders say, look, this is going to change, this is going to transform our world. And sometimes it does, and sometimes it doesn't. This does seem to be one of those major global events, you know, financial crisis of 2008-9, maybe the terrorist attacks of 2001, maybe, and obviously the collapse of the Berlin Wall and communism in 89-90. It does look like one of those great historic events that is going to change the world. Give us your sense. But you know, perhaps, and in some ways, one of the big challenges for all of us is figuring out what will change and how, but also what won't change. Give us your sense, if you would, in terms again of the sustainability agenda. How is this changing, do you think, businesses' approach to everything they do in a way that will impact upon the broader agenda of addressing climate change?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think what we've seen in our space, and you can say what we do for a living, that is connect buyers and sellers and their supply chains digitally. So definitely what we saw happen in this crisis. So many of the drivers behind this. So we have a rising population density. That's also, of course, what helps spread something like this and create a global pandemic. We see a very interconnected world. And what we saw companies wake up to was a situation where they actually, for some of them, couldn't do business because they couldn't get into their mail rooms and fetch this physical mail. And I think both the trends of coronavirus, you know, the geopolitical situation, uncertainty about trade deals, it all kind of highlights the same trend. And that is that the way that supply chains work, the way that your company works and your dependencies on other partners in this space, that relationship is changing in a quite profound way. And I think on the last financial crisis, everybody got a reminder of this. We saw as companies extended payment terms to 90, 120, even 360 days. We saw that had a big impact on supply chains. And I think that's exactly what we are seeing here again. So we have the whole story about companies scrapping to get access to masks, and players springing up and see how can we create a supply chain around this. And I think the reactions have been in many ways. Some are like looking inward and say, we're going to untangle this globally connected web. But at the same time, you see everybody and their grandmother who never bought something on a web shop, they're now buying stuff on a web shop. And so we can see this whole trend of e-commerce, of course, only being boosted by this trend. At the same time, we can see businesses falling further and further behind on the digitization, not so much internally, but everything that happens between the companies. And I think this is going to be a big reminder. And I think all the reasons for also what accelerated this crisis is reflected somehow in the supply chain. We know that a big player like Unilever, for some of their businesses that have a stronger sustainability profile, they have a 30% higher profit in this, but they have a fundamental challenge, and that is, how are we going to redesign our supply chains so we understand and we can optimize in those supply chains? So that pending investment is not going away, and every major company in the world is facing this. And I have a strong belief that digitization is a fundamental enabler and driver of that. So I think this can be one of the watershed events that will actually help drive that agenda. Not let's disconnect, but how are we actually connecting? And in reality, are we connecting? Are we incentivizing people to connect? And I think that's a big question. I have some opinions on that.
Yeah, well, well, I want to come back to that, and I want to come back to Jenny's remarks too. But Bertrand, if I could come to you too, and as Gert said, and as Jenny said, this is, you know, these are clearly profound changes that we're expecting to see, but it's not completely clear yet what direction they all point in. On the one hand, everybody says, well, most people seem to believe that this event will, through its impact on global supply chains, through inducing a much greater degree of caution on the part of consumers and businesses, will probably lead to further rollback of the kind of globalization that we've seen in the last 30 years, more emphasis on national supply, on safety of national supply or local supply. And on the one hand, that could be, you know, that depending on how we manage it, of course, that could be, or presumably reduce some of the carbon footprint that we have through our global supply chains right now. Against that, obviously, again, as Gert says, you know, as more and more people have got used to the sort of digital retail experience, or for businesses even doing more and more commerce digitally, that may actually increase their dependence on delivery systems that may impact on that may have a different impact on sustainability. Give us your sense, if you would, either on that or more generally, about how you think what so far at least, and it's very early days, so far at least, what you see as likely to change in the long term as a result of this crisis.
Well, first, let me answer the questions you raised initially, right? Why am I called blue like an orange?
Yeah.
It's somewhat connected to what we are discussing today. It's not just to please Jenny and the Dutch with the orange flavor, but it's a dual reference. One to Tintin, the comics hero, who actually the only movie was called Tintin and the Mystery of the Blue Orange. And the second reference, which is more relevant to our conversation today, is a poem from a French surrealist poet from the 1920s, Paul Éluard, who wrote a poem called Earth is Blue Like an Orange. And it's very interesting because at that time, nobody had a clue that Earth would look blue from the space, or maybe blue because of the ocean, and it's blue because, as we know, of the atmosphere. So I really like that image, that it's like an orange, meaning it's like a fruit, very rich, but also very fragile. And that was really the meaning of blue like an orange. Coming back more seriously to your questions, I think it's very interesting to have this conversation today, because it reminds me of a very similar conversation we had 12 years ago. If you remember, in 2008 and 2009, people say, never again, we will change everything, etc. And the truth is that we have changed some things, but not everything. And bottom line, the system that we've put in place over the past 12 years is not that dissimilar from the systems that pre-existed the global financial crisis. And here we are again, not to say that the system is a cause of the virus. I think the virus has other causes, but the virus highlights the fault lines of the system we are in. As Jenny says, there's a big issue we are facing is how do we get from where we are today to a system which is both more sustainable and more equitable. And that's really the challenge we have ahead of us. And the point is, we have the roadmap. We tend to forget it, but we have the roadmap, which has been adopted 5 years ago with the Sustainable Development Goals, with COP21 and the various agreements around this. But we never really discussed the underlying needed system to get there. And the big weakness is that everything we've done was based on voluntary commitments. It's a voluntary commitments from countries to go on COP21. It's a voluntary commitment from companies to disclose their carbon footprint. Everything is voluntary. And we have this feeling that because we all are nice people, we will go naturally in that direction. And of course, we were not there at all. And it's very interesting to see whether this crisis will accelerate this move or derail it. And it's not just because a minority of people in advanced economy are enjoying the benefit of e-commerce that it will change the trajectory of the whole world. I mean, that's also a big question. So the real issue is now we are out of the, I would say, rescue phase. We are moving into the recovery phase before fully entering into building a better world phase. And the recovery phase is already very challenging because we lack money. It's as simple as that. I mean, a number of governments will hit the financial world fast. A number of companies will have to restructure fast. And then when this type of situation, the priorities change. And sometimes you might make a decision to go quick and dirty instead of going, you know, a little slower and sustainable. And that's a big challenge we're going to face today. And it will require a lot of vision and leadership to look towards the future and not towards the past. Because the past is very tempting. The past is on the table. And that's, I think, the big challenge we have ahead of us. Look at, I mean, within the EU, it's people keep reaffirming, yes, we want the Green Deal going forward. But I mean, the truth is that a number of countries are not that enthusiastic about the Green Deal. I mean, I'm living in the US. I mean, needless to say, it's not that clear either between, I mean, with the electoral campaign and so on and so forth. So on the one hand, this crisis might be a catalyst to go in the right direction, but we should, I don't think we should fool ourselves. It will not be a natural catalyst. I mean, you need a little push and a little of care to make sure the catalyst goes in the right direction. I don't want to repeat the post-global financial crisis pattern again, where everything is going to change, and then, well, my God.
Maybe it doesn't. Yeah. I mean, some important changes were made in terms of financial system, but I take your point that, yeah, that it didn't maybe have quite the dramatic effect. Jenny, if I can come back to you, obviously to some extent, we're dealing with two crises here right now. One is the public health crisis, which is what we've been dealing with which has been sort of front and center for everybody for the last 2 to 3 months, and depending where you are in the world, somewhat longer than that. We are now, I'm in the US too, and whether you're in the US or Europe, we are very much now into while obviously still being very mindful of the public health dimension, we are also dealing with the massive economic crisis that we have brought about by shutting down our economies. And I know there are different views about how serious that economic crisis will be. Initially, I think there was a lot of optimism that this will be a V-shaped recovery and that we'd all sort of bounce back pretty quickly. My sense is, despite the stock market, that there is a wider belief now, especially among policymakers, that isn't going to be the case, and that actually this could be a prolonged period of economic weakness, if not outright stagnation. What difference does it make in terms of the long-term agenda about sustainability, how severe this economic crisis is beyond the immediate public health crisis?
I think as you think about how to help come out of the crisis, however long it's going to last, and the topic at hand around sustainability, I think there really is a sweet spot that countries and companies should go to first, which is actually where can we help restart the economy and kind of create that economic momentum while also benefiting sustainability. And typically the kind of mindset of governments and companies going into these kinds of things is, let's just get stuff going because we're desperate and we got to kind of start cranking. And actually, I think there's an opportunity to say, before we just dive in, let's ask ourselves, where are there opportunities that are reinforcing both economic growth or economic kind of regeneration and sustainability? I think it's well known, obviously, that the renewable sector actually has way more jobs in it, for example, than some of the dirty energy sectors or kind of black energy sectors in the US. And so is there an opportunity to use the economic recovery as a means of accelerating those? Or indeed, as you think about if you're a company and perhaps you've taken assets offline during the crisis, if you've had to take down factories or other assets, think about how you bring those back online such that actually you're bringing the green ones back online first. It's just like the airlines considering actually maybe the 747 has had its day, and actually if we retire that, it's probably good for the capacity of the industry and good for the environment as well. And so I think that's really the mindset to go in with, and whether that's supported by green recovery stimulus packages or indeed by companies wanting to take the lead and get ahead in this debate, it doesn't actually make much difference as you look at it. In terms of your question, though, of what's the impact of the timing of how long that economic downturn may last, I think clearly the longer it lasts, the more worried, if you will, people will be to just get things going. And perhaps that patience for thinking of new ways to do things may start to wear thin. But for me, that means actually there's a much higher premium of starting on the right foot, because we could easily get into the wrong foot, as opposed to just saying, let's just go back to the way it was, because we need to get some kickstart, some growth.
And thank you. Gert, maybe what specifically, we don't have a huge amount of time, so what specifically do you think we should be looking for in terms of the, I mean, one of the things, I mean, we're all taking part in these Zoom calls and Hangouts and all that kind of stuff, and a lot of the business executives I've spoken to in the last month have all said, you know, we are definitely going to travel much less than we used to. The days are probably gone when, you know, hundreds of thousands of senior executives of companies would get on a plane and fly to the other side of the world for 2 days of meetings and come back again. That's going to have quite a significant impact. But give us, if you would, your sense of, just in the time we have available, some specifics, some specific ways in which businesses are going to change the way, supply chains are going to change the way, we're going to change the way we work.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one of the kind of mistakes or problems with a lot of the sustainability initiatives is that they have been driven by the stick and policies and certifications that companies and even countries tend to resist, because everybody, of course, asks what's in it for us. So I think a lot of this change is actually coming from a slightly different direction. I think it's going to come from economic innovation. And I think we are seeing the contours of some of that now, actually as a direct result of this crisis as well, because we've had companies come and ask us, like, can you help us distribute cash and advance payments to our suppliers to protect our supply chain? We have spoken with governments and made economic calculations that shows by how the government can go in, and for in Danish government case, like 60 million in ensuring the interest on loans to supply chains can unlock $15 billion. But the missing link of this is really what's the documentation of the trade that is going on. And that I think it has very much in common with the sustainability agenda, because what is standing behind us and actually achieving some of these goals is, number one, transparency. We have no idea about what is happening in supply chains. So it's actually an accountability question. There is no accountability, and without digitization, we cannot drive it. So with some of the economic innovation, I think we're seeing now happening in those supply chains about, by looking into digital trade transactions, how can you actually distribute value and money inside those supply chains? That answers the question, how are you going to incentivize people to digitize? And I think in these years, we're actually starting to see some of those patterns that can start sharing some of that value of trade. And for the first time, I'm also seeing companies flocking around that agenda and say, we want to invest in distributing part of that value in our trade in the supply chain. We just don't know how, because nothing is digital. And I think that's going to be a paradigm shift.
That's great. And Bertrand, again, we just have a couple of minutes left. Your view, I mean, Gert talks a lot about the importance of digitization and how that's being accelerated probably in this crisis. From your perspective, what specific areas do you think are going to change in terms of the way businesses work that can have really major outsized impact on sustainability? Bertrand, did you?
Yeah, sorry. No, I think we have had, we just have been through a real life and at scale stress test and acceleration. We've all seen that. Even if I'm still pretty slow at Zoom, I've made good progress over the past 2 months. If it's an indice of the big changes that have happened, I'm seeing that in the investments I'm doing with my investment firm in emerging markets. Again, we should keep in mind that the challenge of sustainability and fairness will be okay if we handle this in the emerging and developing world. At the end of the day, I mean, the new frontier is not the Netherlands, it's not the US, it's not the Denmark, it's not France. That's where we will make a difference. Whether this country move in the sustainability space or not, that will be the difference. And I think technology will really help. I mean, what I'm seeing is a lot of, just take one example, which for me is absolutely critical, which is access to finance. I mean, access to credits, be it for individuals or for SMEs, local SMEs, etc. I mean, you have an acceleration in that field, in particular, because in a number of countries, governments wanted to distribute money, and they couldn't distribute money because physically there were no branches, etc. So they had to go through applications. And I suspect we'll have the same, a number of buckets throughout the value chain that Gert mentioned. So all this will be profoundly accelerated. My concern is to make sure that it's not captured by some rent seeker, if you see what I mean. I mean, there are big companies that really might manage this all benefits for themselves, and we have to make sure this is benefiting the many, not the few. And that's for me a big concern, because as I think Jenny said earlier, we have a sustainability issue, but we have also a social issue. And if the result of this crisis is that we lay off thousands or millions of people because we make huge productivity gains over the next 2 years, okay, we might be better from a productivity front, but then we have a big social problem, which might lead to political issues, etc. And it will be even bigger in emerging and developing economies. So I think we have to carefully move on both the digitization, which will really bear a lot of fruits, but also make sure we accompany this move by the proper social and political framework. For me, it's essential. Technology is crucial, but not in itself. I mean, you need to really build the ecosystem, to root technology in real life, not just push forward, because the backlash might be extraordinary. So that's my concern. So on the one hand, I'm quite optimistic because we see a lot of things happening. On the other hand, I think, look at what happened after the previous crisis. I mean, that's where populism started to accelerate, because we didn't handle it properly. So I don't want to have another crisis after this one.
That's a very good, we're out of time, unfortunately. That's a very, very good note on which to end the tension perhaps between economic efficiency and that we might see as a result of this, and actually, well, not so much the sustainability question, tension, but the broader tension, the broader political and social tensions that we might see as a result of some of the changes that we're bringing about, and the impact that itself may have on people's desire to make the kind of radical changes that are necessary in the longer term. Thank you all indeed. It was a really fascinating discussion. You're all terrific experts. You bring great degree of knowledge to the topic. I certainly learned a lot, and I'm enormously grateful to you, to Jenny, Gert, and Bertrand. So thank you very much indeed for doing this, and stay healthy. And I hope to see you all again, either in person or digitally sometime soon. Thank you.
Great, Gerry. Thanks for your facilitation. Thank you all. Thanks, Gert.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks. Bye.
Many thanks, Gerry, Jenny, Bertrand, and Gert, for taking the time out of your busy schedules to join us. I think my aha moment came in the first 2 minutes, kind of to shift the mindset from it being a dress rehearsal and the importance of resiliency and adaptability.